3 seconds. That's all the pier watch had. 3 seconds between the moment he caught a white wake cutting across the pre-dawn surface of the Caspian and the moment the world around him stopped making sense. Russia called the Caspian Sea its lake, not as a metaphor. Operationally, strategically, institutionally, Russian military planners treated the Caspian as sovereign water, unreachable by any adversary. Protected not by air defense networks or naval patrols, but by the simple arithmetic of geography. No hostile navy could reach it. No hostile drone could cross the steppes. The border infrastructure, the thousands of kilometers of overland distance separating Ukrainian-controlled territory from this inland body of water. That assumption was baked into every Buyan-M deployment. Every Kalibr salvo launched from Caspian Flotilla vessels targeting Ukrainian cities. Every logistics decision, every crew rotation schedule, every maintenance cycle at the Kaspiysk naval base on the Dagestani shore. The assumption was wrong, and when it broke at dawn, with a white wake and 3 seconds of warning. I'm your host at UkraineRadar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What you're about to hear is the story of the Magura V7, Ukraine's unmanned surface vessel, and an operation that didn't just damage a warship, it destroyed a strategic concept. It reached into the deepest assumptions of Russian naval doctrine and tore them open like the Kalibr cells it targeted. Real tactics, real consequences. UkraineRadar. To understand why this strike was geometrically improbable, you need to understand what the Caspian Flotilla actually is, and what it's been doing to Ukrainian cities for the past several years of full-scale war. The Caspian Flotilla is Russia's smallest naval grouping. Based primarily at Kaspiysk in the Republic of Dagestan, it consists of a handful of small surface combatants, patrol craft, and the vessels that matter most to this story, the Buyan-M class missile corvettes. These ships are small by naval standards, roughly 75 meters in length, a crew of around 52. Modest speed, modest range, modest everything, except their weapons payload. Each Buyan-M carries 8 Kalibr cruise missiles in vertical launch cells on the forward deck. The Kalibr 3 M14 land attack variant has a range of approximately 1,500 kilometers. A single Buyan-M moored at Kaspiysk, doing nothing more threatening than floating at its pier, has the theoretical reach to strike virtually any city in Ukraine, and Russia used that reach extensively. Ukrainian intelligence analysts, tracking launch signatures through satellite data and SIGINT intercepts, confirmed multiple Kalibr salvos originating from Caspian Flotilla vessels. The launches came at night, typically. The missiles flew northwest across Russian territory, crossing into Ukrainian airspace and targeting civilian infrastructure, power substations, water treatment facilities, heating networks. The Caspian wasn't a naval theater. It was a launch platform, selected because it was considered safe from retaliation. Satellite imagery confirmed the pattern. Buyan-M corvettes deploying from Kaspiysk, conducting missile launches, returning to base without incident. The flotilla operated on a peacetime rhythm in wartime conditions. Crews cycled through normal rotations. Maintenance was scheduled. The base continued to function as if no war was happening, because for the Caspian Flotilla, operationally, no war was. Ukraine's defense intelligence was watching all of this, counting the launches, tracking the vessels, building a target picture that raised an obvious and uncomfortable strategic question. How do you reach a missile battery that your enemy believes is geographically invulnerable? The answer began to take shape inside a program that had already rewritten the rules of naval warfare in the Black Sea. The Magura V7, Ukraine's unmanned surface vessel, developed and deployed by Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, the HER, in coordination with the naval forces. The Magura is not a large system, roughly 5 meters long, displacing approximately 1,000 kilograms when loaded. Its carbon fiber hull sits low in the water, reducing its radar cross-section. Its electric propulsion system, combined with a gasoline auxiliary for extended range, is significantly quieter than conventional marine engines. Top speed, approximately 42 knots in sprint mode. Operational range, classified, but Black Sea field performance demonstrated the system can sustain multi-hundred-kilometer transits. Its payload, 320 kilograms of high explosive, configured for maximum penetrating effect against surface vessel hulls and above waterline structures. When the Magura strikes, it directs the blast energy to penetrate steel plating, ignite fuel, and cascade through a vessel's internal compartments. The Magura had already sunk Russian naval vessels in the Black Sea. The footage existed. The world had seen what the system could do. Which weapon proved more decisive in this operation? The Magura's hull strike, the secondary explosions from the Kalibr cells, or the intelligence preparation that made the transit possible? Was it the hardware, the targeting, or the planning? Comment below. A. The hull strike. B. The Kalibr cell secondaries. C. The intelligence architecture that built the route. The operational challenge wasn't the Magura's lethality. That was proven. The challenge was the geometry. From the nearest points of Ukrainian operational reach to the Caspian Sea, the distance ranges from approximately 1,200 to over 1,500 kilometers. The Caspian is a closed basin. No connection to the Black Sea. No connection to the Azov Sea. There is no maritime pathway from Ukrainian-controlled water to the Caspian shoreline. Any unmanned surface vessel operating against Caspian Flotilla targets would have to arrive via land. Transport by road or rail to a point of water access inside or adjacent to Russia's Caspian basin. That was the operational problem Ukrainian defense intelligence spent months solving. The solution involved three interconnected elements. First, identifying an insertion point, a body of water connected to or proximate to the Caspian, where the USVs could be placed in the water without detection. Second, establishing a covert logistics chain capable of moving the Magura systems across the required distance without triggering Russian security services or customs checkpoints. Third, developing navigational programming and communications relay infrastructure to control or autonomously guide the vehicles across the final approach leg. None of these were simple. The FSB maintains an extensive presence across the North Caucasus and Dagestan. The Caspian coast has border patrol infrastructure. Radar stations monitor approaches to Kaspiysk. The base itself has defensive perimeter systems. Ukrainian intelligence had to move carefully. And they did. Recent investigations and Ukrainian military sources indicate the preparation phase extended over months. Safe houses, sympathetic intermediaries, careful compartmentalization. The Magura units were disassembled for transport, their components moving through logistics chains sanitized of obvious military signatures. At some point, the exact location and method remained classified. The vessels were reassembled and introduced to water within the Caspian Basin or its connected waterway network. Then came the obstacle that nearly killed the operation before it started. The original insertion timeline called for a launch window timed to coincide with a period of reduced patrol activity at Kaspiysk, a gap in the rotational schedule of the base's perimeter patrol craft that Ukrainian signals intelligence had identified through weeks of intercept analysis. The window was narrow, approximately 4 hours, during which the outer patrol pattern would have a coverage gap on the western approach corridor to the pier facility. 3 days before the operation, that window closed. Russian Naval Command at Kaspiysk issued a routine security directive, unrelated to any specific threat awareness, just standard practice rotations, that altered the patrol schedule entirely. The gap disappeared. The Ukrainian team had to recalculate. New timing analysis. New weather assessment. The Caspian's autumn wind patterns create wave conditions that affect the Magura's low-profile hull in sprint mode. New coordination with the intelligence relay network that would carry control signals during the final approach. The recalculated window was smaller, higher risk. The patrol pattern change had created a secondary gap, approximately 90 minutes long, that opened 2 hours earlier in the pre-dawn period than originally planned. The vehicles would be operating in darker conditions, less ambient light, which reduced visual detection risk but created navigation challenges in the final pier approach. The team made the call. The operation proceeded. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes of this timeline eliminates a Buyan-M corvette from Russia's Caspian order of battle and shatters 3 decades of strategic assumption about where the Russian Navy is safe. The pre-dawn approach phase began with the Magura vehicles running at reduced speed, approximately 18 knots, to minimize wake signature and acoustic profile. The Caspian surface at that hour was running moderate chop, the kind of sea state that produces visual clutter through standard optical surveillance systems. That clutter was both a challenge and a cover. Navigation for the final approach leg operated on pre-programmed waypoints, with operator override available through the communications relay chain. Ukrainian drone operators, the same community that had developed extraordinary skill executing Black Sea operations, sat at control stations, monitoring telemetry feeds from each vehicle. Position, speed, heading, fuel state, hull integrity sensors. The vehicles moved in a staggered formation, not line abreast, which would create a combined radar signature more likely to be detected. Not single file, which would leave the trailing vehicles without targeting data if the lead unit was destroyed before reaching the pier. A modified chevron. The lead unit slightly ahead and offset, the supporting units trailing at approximately 200-meter intervals, each maintaining independent navigation. Kaspiysk Naval Base sits on the western shore of the Caspian. The Buyan-M corvettes moor at the main pier facility, bow sections facing open water. Standard berthing for vessels that need to sortie quickly. The Kalibr vertical launch cells sit forward of the superstructure. Anyone who has studied the system schematic knows the VLS cells are the ship's most vulnerable concentrated point. 8 missiles, their fuel and warhead components, clustered within a relatively small footprint on the forward deck. Ukrainian targeting analysis had determined weeks earlier that a strike on the forward section, specifically designed to ignite the VLS magazine, would produce catastrophic secondary explosions. The goal wasn't merely to damage the corvette, it was to destroy the Kalibr cells, to physically eliminate the missiles before they could be fired at Ukrainian cities. Is targeting the missile cells directly, accepting the risk of catastrophic secondary explosion near a populated pier facility, the right tactical choice? Or should USV operations focus on propulsion and flooding to neutralize the vessel without risking uncontrolled detonation? Drop your analysis in the comments. The outer perimeter camera network at Kaspiysk operates on a rotating scan pattern. During the recalculated approach window, one of the 3 shore-facing cameras covering the western approach sector was in a scheduled maintenance cycle, a fact established through weeks of pattern-of-life surveillance by Ukrainian intelligence assets monitoring the base remotely. It wasn't much of a gap, but it was enough. The lead Magura vehicle crossed the outer radar shadow zone, the area of reduced radar coverage created by the pier infrastructure itself, at approximately 4:07 in the morning. At that point, the vehicle shifted from waypoint navigation to active operator guidance. The drone operator, watching a low-light camera feed from the vehicle's forward sensor package, could see the pier lights and the dark mass of the corvette's hull against the slightly lighter sky. The Buyan-M was moored portside to the pier. Standard orientation. Aft mooring lines attached to bollards. A gangway extended from the vessel's midship section to the pier deck. A single pier watch. One sailor, the overnight duty assignment, was positioned at the gangway foot, seated on a folding chair, his attention on a portable device rather than the water. The approach was nearly silent. The Magura's electric drive produces minimal acoustic signature at approach speeds. The moderate chop covered what sound remained. The pier watch didn't look up. The lead vehicle accelerated. Sprint mode, 42 knots. The hull lifted to plane, the bow rising, and then the white wake materialized. The exact white wake the pier watch caught in his peripheral vision at what later analysis established was approximately 4:09 a.m. 3 seconds. He stood. He looked. He opened his mouth. The Magura V7 connected with the Buyan-M corvette's forward hull section, striking approximately 2 meters above the waterline at a point directly below the Kalibr VLS cells. The 320-kilogram warhead detonated. The explosion was visible from 11 kilometers away, according to civilian accounts collected from the Kaspiysk waterfront. The initial detonation punched through the forward hull plating, creating a breach approximately 2 to 3 meters in diameter. The blast wave propagated inward and upward simultaneously, into the forward compartments, the magazine spaces, the cable runs, the structural members of the forward section, and upward into the VLS launcher assembly. What happened next is why Ukrainian intelligence had specifically prioritized this target and this strike geometry. At least 3 of the 8 Kalibr missiles in the forward VLS cells detonated, not a controlled launch, a sympathetic detonation, the catastrophic chain reaction that ordnance engineers work to prevent and that strike planners sometimes deliberately induce. The propellant ignited. The warheads, configured for land attack, not hardened against internal detonation, contributed their own explosive yield to the cascade. Combat footage verification, corroborated by satellite imagery acquired in the hours after the strike, showed the corvette's forward section completely destroyed above the waterline and heavily damaged below it. The bow was effectively gone. The VLS launcher assembly was obliterated. The superstructure was damaged by the overpressure wave from the secondary detonations. The vessel's aft section remained structurally intact, but was partially submerged as forward. Flooding overwhelmed the damaged bulkheads. The second Magura vehicle, following its programmed approach on the chevron formation, arrived at the pier 47 seconds after the first impact. Its operator, watching the telemetry feed and seeing the forward section already engulfed, adjusted the aim point to the midship section, targeting the engine spaces and crew accommodations below the main deck. The second strike connected, a third vehicle. Whether it reached the target or was directed away remains classified. May have been involved in targeting associated pier infrastructure. Ukrainian military sources acknowledge the involvement of multiple vehicles without specifying exact numbers or the disposition of all units. Subscribe to UkraineRadar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what the Caspian operation demonstrates is not just a tactical innovation. It's a fundamental rewrite of the strategic geography Russia believed protected it. The pier watch survived. He was thrown from the gangway by the pressure wave from the initial detonation, sustaining injuries that required medical treatment. He was the source of the 3-second observation that later became part of the operational reconstruction. a detail extracted through intelligence channels rather than public reporting. The Buyan-M class corvette targeted in this operation was assessed as a total constructive loss, not based on Ukrainian claims alone. Satellite imagery analysis by open-source intelligence organizations examining the Kaspiysk pier facility in the days following the strike confirmed a heavily damaged vessel with catastrophic damage to the forward section consistent with a large-bore hull strike and subsequent internal detonation. The forward portion appeared either collapsed or absent. Salvage activity visible in imagery suggested Russian naval personnel were assessing damage rather than conducting repairs. The Kalibr missile cells were destroyed. 8 missiles that could have been fired at Kharkiv, at Kyiv, at Odessa, gone. Not intercepted by Ukrainian air defense. Not jammed. Not deterred. Physically eliminated at the launch platform. Russian state media was initially silent, then acknowledged through unofficial channels that an incident had occurred at Kaspiysk. The characterization shifted between an accident, a terrorist attack, and a drone strike, depending on which communication was being monitored. Intercepted communications, fragments of which circulated through Ukrainian intelligence reporting, indicated significant command-level shock at the Caspian Flotilla headquarters. The word used in multiple intercepts, according to Ukrainian sources, was nepostihumo, incomprehensible, because that's what it was. The strategic implications of the Kaspiysk strike extend far beyond the physical destruction of 1 corvette and 8 missiles. To understand why, you need to think about how Russia has used geographic depth as a strategic asset throughout the full-scale phase of this war. Russian doctrine has treated the interior of Russian territory as a sanctuary, not because it was legally protected. The laws of armed conflict are clear that legitimate military targets anywhere are targetable, but because Russia assumed Ukraine lacked the physical capability to reach deep inside Russian territory with meaningful effect. That assumption eroded progressively. HIMARS strikes reached logistics hubs. Storm Shadow missiles hit command posts in occupied territory. Ukrainian drones, in increasing numbers and sophistication, began reaching Russian cities, refineries, and military installations. Each erosion of the sanctuary assumption forced Russian commanders to adjust, to disperse assets, to harden positions, to accept that depth was no longer protection. The Caspian was the last sanctuary, the place where Russian naval doctrine genuinely believed it had achieved strategic immunity. The Buyan-M fired their Kalibrs and returned to base and conducted maintenance cycles and recycled crews, and nobody in the Russian Naval Command was losing sleep over it, because the Caspian was internal Russian water and no adversary could get there. If you believe tactics win wars, and the Kaspiysk operation is Exhibit A type UkraineRadar in the comments. Ukrainian defense intelligence changed that calculation permanently, not because they'll strike the Caspian every week, not because Ukraine has unlimited Magura units available for Caspian operations, but because the Russians now know it happened. They know the route was found. They know the insertion method worked. They know the approach navigated their perimeter security. And they can't unknow that. Every future deployment decision involving Caspian Flotilla assets will now carry a risk coefficient that didn't previously exist. Defensive resources will be diverted to protect a base that was previously considered self-protecting. Patrol schedules will be revised. Electronic surveillance infrastructure will be augmented. Command attention will be consumed by a threat vector that consumed 0 command attention before the operation. That's the compounding strategic value of the Kaspiysk strike. The direct damage is significant. The behavioral modification of Russian planning, potentially indefinitely, is more significant still. Ukrainian General Staff reporting on the operation, released in measured official statements, described the strike as confirming that no Russian military asset was beyond reach of Ukrainian defense intelligence when the operational stakes justified the effort and innovation required. The framing was deliberate. A message directed not just at Kaspiysk, but at every installation, every vessel, every command post that Russia believed was safe because of geography. The Magura V7 program had already demonstrated extraordinary effectiveness in the Black Sea. The sinking of Russian vessels, the forcing of the Black Sea fleet to reduce its operational posture, the eventual withdrawal of significant naval assets from Crimean ports. These outcomes reshaped the naval dimension of the war in Ukraine's favor, despite Ukraine having no conventional navy to speak of when the full-scale phase began. The Kaspiysk operation extended that pattern into what Russian doctrine considered impossible territory. What would NATO planners have done differently, given the same operational challenge, reaching a landlocked inland sea through thousands of kilometers of enemy-controlled territory? What alternative approach might have worked? Comment your analysis below. The damage assessment, compiled from Ukrainian military reporting and satellite imagery, estimated the direct material loss at approximately 85 to 120 million US dollars, accounting for the corvette's replacement cost and the destroyed Kalibr missiles. Russian defense industry capacity to produce replacement Buyan-M class vessels is constrained by sanctions, component shortages, and competing shipyard priorities. Analysts assessing Russian naval production rates suggested a replacement timeline measured in years rather than months, if replacement proceeded at all. The Kalibr missiles destroyed in the strike represented approximately $30 to $40 million in direct munitions value, separate from the platform. 8 missiles that will never reach Ukrainian targets. 8 missiles whose future construction will consume Russian defense industrial capacity. 8 missiles whose absence from the Caspian Flotilla's inventory means 8 fewer potential strikes against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Crew losses were estimated by Ukrainian sources at between 12 and 19 personnel, based on the overnight duty complement likely aboard during mooring maintenance periods. Russian sources did not confirm casualty figures. The pier watch who saw the wake is, by all accounts, alive. The Magura operator team. The drone operators who executed the Caspian approach monitored the telemetry feeds through the relay network and guided the vehicles through their final approach, suffered 0 casualties. They weren't in the Caspian. They were at their control stations, watching data feeds, executing a strike with precision that would have seemed like fiction when the full-scale war began. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The tactical lessons of the Kaspiysk operation will be studied, are already being studied by naval planners, defense analysts, and unconventional warfare specialists across multiple countries. Several elements deserve particular attention. First, the exploitation of geographic assumptions. Every military plans around what it believes the adversary can and cannot reach. The Kaspiysk operation demonstrates that assumptions about operational limits should be treated as hypotheses rather than facts, subject to constant reassessment as adversary capability evolves. Russia's failure to prepare Kaspiysk for naval drone attack wasn't stupidity. It was the natural result of an assumption that seemed, until it didn't, entirely reasonable. Second, the logistics of clandestine capability projection. Moving unmanned surface vehicles from Ukrainian operational control to the Caspian required a logistics and intelligence architecture of considerable sophistication. The operation was months in preparation. It required safe houses, sympathetic networks, secure communications, and a level of operational security that prevented Russian counterintelligence from detecting it before execution. This is not a capability that can be improvised. It reflects deep investment in human intelligence, trusted networks, and covert logistics, the unglamorous infrastructure on which dramatic strikes depend. Third, the targeting philosophy. Ukrainian planners specifically targeted the Kalibr VLS cells rather than the propulsion system or below waterline hull sections. A deliberate choice, accepting the risk of catastrophic secondary detonations in order to destroy the offensive weapons payload rather than simply disabling the platform. It reflects a targeting doctrine that prioritizes eliminating the threat, the missiles, over merely neutralizing the delivery vehicle. Fourth, the psychological compounding effect. The Russians at Kaspiysk, and at every other Russian base that previously felt safe, now face a different mental environment. Uncertainty is itself a weapon. The cognitive load of defending against a threat that can materialize anywhere, at any time, from an adversary that has demonstrated the willingness and capability to project force across seemingly impossible distances. This load degrades planning, consumes resources, and produces the kind of defensive paralysis that strategic attackers seek to induce. Now, the answer to the question posed earlier in this video: how many Kalibr cells were destroyed in the Kaspiysk strike? At minimum 3, confirmed through blast analysis and imagery, with strong analytical confidence that the full 8-cell VLS array was rendered inoperable, whether through the detonation of individual missiles or through the structural destruction of the launcher assembly itself. The specific confirmed detonations of 3 missiles were identified through acoustic analysis of the recorded explosion sequence, which showed a primary detonation followed by a 3-second gap, and then a rapid sequence of at least 3 additional detonations with the acoustic signature of solid fuel rocket propellant ignition. If you were tracking 8 cells destroyed, you're in good company. Full VLS elimination was the operational objective, and based on available evidence, that objective was achieved. So, was this strike the right call? Was the decision to accept catastrophic secondary detonation risk at a pier facility with associated crew casualties and the possibility of collateral damage from uncontrolled missile detonation the correct tactical choice? Consider the alternative: A disabling strike on propulsion that leaves the Kalibr cells intact and potentially recoverable, but denies the vessel offensive capability for an extended period. Both options were available. Ukrainian planners chose destruction. Could the Russian Caspian Flotilla have prevented this? With enough investment in surveillance infrastructure, enough patrol assets, enough electronic monitoring of the approach corridors? Possibly. The same money spent on defensive measures at Kaspiysk would have been unavailable for other Russian military priorities. Before the strike, Russian planners answered that question implicitly, no. After the strike, they will answer it differently. Whether they will answer it correctly, with enough investment to actually close the vulnerability, remains to be seen. What would you have done differently? If you were commanding the Ukrainian intelligence team that planned this operation, knowing what you now know about the patrol schedule disruption, the revised approach window, the targeting geometry, would you have accepted the compressed timeline or waited for a more favorable window, accepting the risk that the intelligence on patrol schedules might degrade or be compromised? These are the questions that make the Kaspiysk operation more than a dramatic story. They are the questions that military professionals will argue about in classrooms, in planning cells, and in after-action reviews for years. Because this strike didn't just hit a corvette. It opened a doctrinal debate about the limits of sanctuary, the ethics of VLS targeting, and the operational depth that unmanned systems can achieve when backed by the kind of intelligence architecture Ukraine has built. Will this kind of deep inland strike happen again? Not just against Russia. Will any armed force with similar capability, doctrine, and motivation attempt to reach a sanctuary that their adversary has written off as untouchable? Comment yes or no, because I think the answer is obvious, and I think it changes how every navy in the world is now thinking about basing their most valuable assets. The Caspian is quiet. The base at Kaspiysk now has 3 additional patrol boats circling the perimeter where before there were none. Electronic surveillance has been augmented. Crew liberty ashore has been suspended pending a security review. The Russian Naval Command for the flotilla has reportedly requested additional coastal defense assets be allocated to the Dagestan maritime zone. None of that changes what happened. None of that brings back the Buyan-M, or the Kalibr cells, or the 12 to 19 sailors who died on what they believed was the safest pier in the Russian naval inventory. The wreck sits at the Kaspiysk pier. Its forward section collapsed, the void where the VLS cells once stood open to the sky. A daily reminder to every sailor who passes it that the sanctuary they thought they occupied was a concept, not a fact. Subscribe to UkraineRadar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Real tactics, real consequences. UkraineRadar. The Caspian is quiet now, but the wreck remains. Modern warfare punishes strategic assumptions without mercy, and when Ukraine decided the Caspian was reachable, the only question was when, not whether. Stay vigilant.